We're going to start a new series today on the Sermon on the Mount. So that's Jesus' most famous sermon found in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. So we're going to be able to just have enough time, I think, barely to go over the first part, which is the Beatitudes. And it's a very rich text. And so I'm going to try to speak fast so I can cover the entire, which means you have to listen fast, right? So if I speak fast, you guys have to listen fast. So let's go dive right in. Okay, so Matthew 5, 1 through 12. And I'll just read it and you can just kind of follow along. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, I want to pause there. He is addressing his disciples. This is not to the general crowd. These are the people who said, I want to be a follower of Jesus. So this is the sermon that he gives to his followers on what it means to be part of his kingdom, where God is king, where Jesus is king. Okay? And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So this is what's known as the Beatitudes. I once heard a pastor kind of cleverly called it the B-attitudes, like the Beatitudes. So I thought that was kind of clever. So what are the Beatitudes? So it comes from the Latin phrase, abidi, which is blessing. So when we understand the word blessing, in our culture today, we don't really use that word. I mean, I think the only time I was trying to think when we use the word blessing is when you sneeze, right? Somebody will say, bless you. But other than that, we don't really use it too much. And so we might not have a good idea what this word actually means. And when we consider the New Testament and how it's used over again, it has to do with joy and happiness, but it's more than that. It's the good life. And when God says, blessed are, and then he goes on to say, this is how, from God's perspective, that we are to have flourishing, thriving, the good life. And so here Jesus is instructing his followers, us today, if you want to live the good life, at least the way that God defines good life, these are the principles that we are to live by. Now, as soon as I say that, principles, good life and guidelines, I think we have sort of an obstacle against that, because we think of principles, and in our minds, we equate it with rules. And growing up, I don't know what your experience was, but rules was a negative, right? So one of my experience with fourth grade teacher was Mr. Miller. That's not Mr. Miller, but Mr. Miller was one of these people that it was an elementary school teacher, and you wonder, why did he become an elementary school teacher? Because he clearly did not like kids. And he clearly did not like us, and he made that very clear. And so, he thought we were too noisy, too rowdy, and all of those things. So he had a million rules by which he can control us and keep this rowdy group of fourth graders orderly. And, when you can go to the bathroom, when you can raise your hand, and when you can ask questions, all of those things. And so we think of principles and we think of rules and say, oh, I get it. So it must be that God doesn't like people. And God has this disorderly universe with a disorderly humanity. And so he's going to give us a bunch of rules so that he can keep us quiet and not annoy him. And so sometimes people approach the Beatitudes or the Bible in that way. And that would be very mistaken way to approach the Beatitudes or Sermon on the Mount or anything in the Bible. And it's more like life is sort of like a maze or a gigantic building that you and I have to sort of navigate our way through. And the person who could help us is the architect who designed that building. So he knows all of the stairways, all the secret tunnels and hallways. He says, oh yeah, if you want to get through, here, let me show you. And so let me just show you a fun video clip now. It's an old movie, and let me just sort of set the context. In this movie, the CIA is bad, they're evil, and they're trying to kill this guy. And another guy's trying to help him. So some of you might recognize the clip, but let's go ahead and watch it right now. I wanted to show you guys that clip because I think in a way, God's word kind of at times is received by us in that way. We don't know why God's telling us to do this, and to us, it seems like, oh, that's the wrong way to live, and why would I want to live like this? And so, tie your shoes right now. And so, okay, all right, I'm going to Beatitudes right now. And they said, okay, now walk to the left, and then close the door, and all of those things. And we think these seem so arbitrary. And this is just ruining my life. It's just clamping me down. I really like what Pastor J.P. Pokluda says in his book, Outdata. He says, the principle in the Bible are not so much rules to be followed as they are really good ideas that will never steer us wrong. And so sometimes we may not understand why God is telling us to do certain things, like the Beatitudes. But the intention of this is not like Mr. Miller trying to control these fourth graders and keep them in check. But God gave us His Bible. God gave us the Beatitudes, and they will never steer us wrong. And so many times we find ourselves in the position of that reporter, Ross, and we don't know why God is telling us this, but we have to trust Him, that He is our creator, He knows what He's doing, He made us, and He knows what will enable us to thrive and flourish in our life. And so we need to follow Him just as that reporter needed to follow Jason Bourne's instruction in order to live. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at the first Beatitudes, because when we see these Beatitudes, and there's 8 of them, we look at that, and just honestly speaking, right, each and every one of them, our initial reaction is, I don't want to do that. I don't want to live like that. And it goes against everything that we have been trained and raised to think with each of those Beatitudes. So, for example, the first one, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the world has trained us to think, no, that's not true. Blessed are the rich, because they're going to be comfortable. And so for each and every one of these, I think there is sort of a opposite counterpart beatitude of the world. And so I would like for you to do that with just 2 of them. I mean, there's 8 of them. So I just picked verse 4 and 6. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And what would be the world's version, kind of inverting, as I did with the first one, of these 2 Beatitudes? So why don't you go ahead, get into 2s and 3s and go ahead and do that with these 2. And then if you don't know each other, of course, introduce yourself. Okay? Go ahead. Can we have more lively music? Okay, if I could ask you to wrap up. Hopefully you guys had some interesting discussion as you try to do the world's version. And so I came up with my own of these 8 Beatitudes inverted in what the world would say. So blessed are the rich, for they shall be comfortable. Blessed are those who laugh, for they don't have to think about depressing things. Blessed are those who define their own standards, because they don't have to live by anyone else's rules. Blessed are those who love money, because they will get everything they want. Blessed are those who show no mercy to others, because then everyone will be scared to mess with them. Blessed are those who look out for themselves, because they will succeed. Blessed are those who are powerful and intimidating, because they will get their way with others. Blessed are those the people who are liked by others, applauded by others, because they will then help you reach your goals. And so, I only had you guys do that with a couple of the Beatitudes, but clearly we see that, Jesus' Beatitudes and the world's version of the Beatitudes are so different. They're almost like 180 degrees different. And my question to you is, when you consider your own values that you live by, when you consider your own actions, when you consider the way that you talk to people, maybe even this past week, is it more like Jesus' Beatitudes, or is it more like the world's? And I think what makes it tricky is you can come to a Sunday service like this and we can read the Beatitudes together and say, oh, that's right, I got to live like this. That's my plumb line. Yeah, I should live like that. And intellectually in your head, you would agree, of course, this is Jesus speaking, so I should live like this. But then when we dismiss from here and you go back to your dorms, you go back to your work, all of those things, for the rest of the week, this is just 1 hour of your week. For the rest of the week, the majority of your time, you are in the world, and you are just surrounded and swimming in the world's value system. And so it's kind of like when you go to a Korean barbecue dinner, everybody knows you went to a Korean barbecue dinner, right? Because you're swimming in that smell, and so that by the time you emerge, it's just all over you. And in the same way, the rest of this week, you're swimming in the world's values, and it's just all over you. And some of that will inevitably find their way into our heart, find their way into our heads, and start influencing us and trying to get us to live like the world's Beatitudes. And so that's why the Word of God is always relevant. Each and every time we hear it, not because the Word of God changes when we come to it again, but because our heart has shifted over the week. Our heart has changed. And so we need to, once again, open up ourselves again and say, God, please speak to me. Please help me to examine my heart. And so that's kind of the posture that I want to ask you guys to consider as we start today's message, going in one at a time. So I'm going to skip this and go into the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So here in the Luke's version, it just says, blessed are the poor. He doesn't even go into blessed are the poor in spirit. And so let's just start with that. What could possibly be the blessing of being just physically poor? Not having enough money to pay the bills, not having enough money to have food sometimes. What could be the blessing of being poor? Well, I think being poor does have this kind of blessing. There's that term that people use, sheltered, right? And then sometimes people will say, oh yeah, you had just such a sheltered life. And so what does that mean when somebody said that you lived a sheltered life? It means that you always lived protected. You always had enough walls by your parents' money, by the kind of upbringing that you had, so that you were protected from the harsh realities of life. And so things like not being able to pay the next month's mortgage or rent, or not being being able to afford even health insurance, so that when you were sick, being able to go to the hospital, all of those things was never in your experience. But if you are poor, that is part of your experience. You are not sheltered from the harsh realities of life, and therefore, you are more realistic. You know more of what real life is all about. And so in that sense, even just being physically poor, it can be a blessing. And so when it comes to then poor in spirit, well, what does that mean? So kind of using the physically poor as a parallel, to be in poor in spirit is to recognize, spiritually speaking, I am poor. Spiritually speaking, there's a lot of brokenness within me that I do not like. I am not the person that I when I was little and when I was growing up, I want to be this kind of person one day at that age. Well, I look at myself right now as a 52-year-old. You look at yourself right now as a 20-year-old. Are you the person that you had hoped that you would be at this age? I think for all of us, no. We had hoped that we would be more generous, we'd be more loving, more servant, like all of those things. And we see a lot of just twistedness within us, where we are not able to rejoice when our friend does well. And out of envy, we actually, truth be told, we rejoice when our friend does poorly. And we might say with our words, next time you can do better on that midterm or whatever. But inside, I did better than her. And so there's so much within us that is broken. There's so much within us that is, just spiritually speaking, poor. And Jesus says, as the first Beatitudes, that's a blessed state to be in. Because when you when you recognize that you're poor in spirit, then you recognize, I need help. I need help from the outside. I need God. And that's the first step. That's the first beatitude that Jesus has here. And so many times, you may have heard different people come up at a retreat or a Sunday service, and they share their testimony. They share their spiritual journey. And if you notice, there's sort of a commonality that in everybody's story, there's usually some kind of crisis point. And it might be like one of the parents getting cancer. It might be a death of a loved one. It might be something maybe not as dramatic, but just them realizing that there's something wrong with my life and just being bothered by that. But there is this point where they become poor in spirit. And it causes them to be a little bit more open to God and to seek God. And so let me ask for you, what is that moment in your life where you became poor in spirit so that you were humbled enough to begin to seek God? And so I realize that this is a little bit more personal question, so I am going to ask you to discuss this, but if you want to pass, that's totally fine. And so maybe somebody around you then who feels comfortable sharing about their being poor in spirit can share their stories. But let me go ahead and give you guys a couple minutes to discuss this. Okay, if I could ask you to wrap up again. So moving on with the next beatitude, which reads, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Now, many Christians who have studied the Beatitudes have noticed, and I think they're absolutely correct in this, that there is sort of a progression among these 8 Beatitudes. The first leads to the second, and second leads to the third, and so forth. It's not a random list of blessings here that Jesus gives for us. And so then what is the progression between the first two? Blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who mourn. And so we talked about what being poor in spirit is, to recognize that, boy, when I look inside of me, there's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of spiritual bankruptcy. Well, that person then begins to look outside at the world and recognize that same brokenness that I see within me, boy, I see it all over the world. All that is broken in our society, all that is just messed up, the way that people treat one another, the way different countries treat one another, at its core, at its root, it's the same. It's individuals who have that same spiritual bankruptcy in their hearts. And so you put a bunch of them together, thousands of them together, you get this broken society. And as you reflect upon that, and as that dawns on you, you begin to mourn over it. You experience grief over not just me, but man, all of us. We're so hopeless. We're so broken in our humanity. And those kinds of reality checks are really good for us, and which is why the Bible gives us this very interesting verse in Ecclesiastes. It is better to go to the house of mourning, which is basically, it's better to go to the funeral than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. It's better to go to a funeral than to go to a typical college party, is what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying. Why? You think about the typical, the college party from Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night that happens probably throughout Boston and all the colleges across America. And I always found it very interesting that what kind of experience you have. So you talk to a friend who, let's say, went to one of these parties, and the next day, he gets a hangover, and he passed out at the night before because he drank so much, and he can't remember any of that. And you ask this very same friend, "Hey, you went to that party. How was it? Did you have a good time?" And he'll say, "Oh yeah, I had a blast. It was so fun." "Oh, what did you do?" "Oh, I met some new people." "Oh, who did you meet?" I can't remember their names. I passed out." "Oh, well, what did you talk about? You must have some good conversation before you passed out." "Oh, I can't remember what we talked about." "What are you going to do next Friday?" "I'm going to go to the same party. It was so fun. You should come." And so it just doesn't make any sense that a person would go back again and again to such an experience where they have a big headache, they cannot remember anything that happened, and then they still label it as so much fun. I want to do that again and again. And what does that reveal? That en masse, our society is just really good at escapism. Just trying to escape. And it could be through parties, and if you say, "Oh, parties is not my thing," well, what is the avenues that you use to escape? Is it video games? Is it binge watching on Netflix? Is it just going on YouTube? What is it for you? What are you trying to avoid? What are you trying to ignore? And that's why Ecclesiastes chapter 7 says, it's better to attend a funeral where you cannot escape just the sheer reality of life. That one day I'm going to be in that casket. One day all of my loved ones will be in that casket. Life is short. Eternity is long. All of these realities that we try so hard to ignore and escape from, at a funeral, we cannot escape from it. And so the second beatitude of learning to mourn over the state of humanity, not just brokenness within me, but a state of humanity, that's what it's talking about. And then the next beatitude, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And I think this is clearly one of the most misunderstood of the beatitudes, because when we read these words, blessed are the meek, automatically we do this mental translation. We say, oh, I know what this is talking about. Jesus is saying, blessed are the weak. And in our mind, that doesn't make any sense. Blessed are the weak who are too scared to stand up for themselves. Blessed are the scared, those who are too cowardly to attempt anything. Blessed are the wimps, those who get bullied by others. Is that what Jesus is talking about here in this Beatitudes? And that's couldn't be further from the truth. And so that word meek is not weak. That's not what the Greek word means. And so the way that word meek is used in the Greek literature is often used to describe a horse. So here you have this wild horse that's running around outside, and horses are one of the most buffest animals. I don't know if I can use that word, but look at the muscles there, right? I mean, he doesn't even work out, but he's got rippling muscles. And so a horse is a buff animal, right? But despite all its strength, that strength is not serving any purpose, just running around out there in the wild. And so how do you use that strength? It's when a trainer catches that wild horse and tames it, makes it meek, makes it controllable by the rider. And then all of the strength, all of the muscles of that horse could be used to do something like that, jumping over these huge walls because it's been tamed by the rider. And that's what that word meek is talking about. And so, in that sense, what is this beatitude saying is that we need to be tamed by God so that all of our desires, all of our wild passions, it becomes tamed by the one who ought to tame us. Now, this goes against a lot of what we're told in our world to do. Because in our world that says, if you have any desires, in order to go after it, you got to just go after it. Like duh, like that's the way that you're going to obtain it. So if you want to be happy, then the world says the only way to be happy is you got to just pursue it with all that you have. You just go after that happiness, hunt it down, pursue it, grab it, and strangle it if need be, because that's how you're going to be happy in life. And if you think about it, it's our common experience that life doesn't work that way. Many times, the person who goes after something in life ends up eluding it. It's evasive to them. And so I know that sounds very abstract, so let me just kind of give you a couple of examples. Let's say that your desire in high school was, I want to be the most popular person in this high school. I want to have the most number of friends in this high school. So that person becomes the most, fewest friends in that high school. Because everybody can sense that you don't really want to be my friend. You're just trying to be the most popular kid at school. You're not really interested in me. And so people are turned off by that person's fakeness. And so ironically, the person who tries to be the most popular actually doesn't have many friends. I think in a similar way, the person who says, I want to be healthy. I want to be healthy. I want to be healthy today. I want to be healthy next week. I want to be healthy next month. That person, how are they going to approach that? Oh, I'm vitamin D deficient, so I got to go outside and get some sunlight. Oh, but then if I go outside, I can get skin cancer. Oh no, what am I going to do? And so then they become very anxious and nervous and worried, and then their health plummets as a result. And so it's what C.S. Lewis says. Put first things first, and we get second things thrown in. Put second things first, and we lose both first and second things. And Jesus says the exact same thing in Matthew chapter 6. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And so going back to that beatitude of meekness, how does this work out then? The person who says, I'm poor in spirit, I know that when I tried to run my own life, I ruined it. I ran my life to the ground. And so I need help. And we all need help, right? That being mourning over it. And so now I'm no longer going to be like that wild horse running around trying to do life my own way. Instead, I'm going to make myself meek before God and ask God to take over my life. Please, you be the king over my life, not me. Because I know that when I try to be king over my life, I've ruined it, God. And this is basically a picture of the gospel, right? Surrendering our life to Christ, saying, Jesus, I cannot do my life. You be the Lord over my life. Thank you so much for making it possible for me to be saved. Now you have your way over me. That's a picture of salvation. That's a picture of responding to the gospel. Now, once a person does that, the next beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. And here I think the word righteousness could be taken as a right relationship with God. So remember, the Beatitudes can be thought of as a progression. So once you recognize that I can't do my life on my own, I want to submit to God, then the next step is I really want that right relationship with God. That becomes something that I hunger and even thirst for. Now, in our day in society, because we live in such a comfortable society, we don't know the last time. I don't know the last time that you went hungry. But during Jesus' time, most people lived in total poverty. So for them, if they could have one meal a day for consecutive days, they're doing well. And when I think about blessed are those who hunger, I was reminded of this book, Scarcity, which talked about this real-life example. During World War II, the U.S. government sought volunteers to enter this experiment to basically starve. Not starve to death, but almost starve to death. And the reason why they wanted to do this study was because they were recognizing that the POWs, those who were caught by Germany and Japanese forces abroad, when they rescued them, they were almost starved to death. And so how can we then bring them back to health? And so there were these men who, for religious reasons, so they were like Quakers, and so they couldn't volunteer to fight in the war. But, this is the way I could serve my country and help my fellow countrymen. And so they volunteered to enter into these starvation experiments. And so they were carefully limited in terms of how many calories a day and all of that. And then it was very fascinating. The people who were part of that experiment, they said that their minds began to change. So for example, when they watched a movie and they talked about the movie afterwards, they couldn't remember anything from the movie. They couldn't remember the characters' names. They couldn't remember any of the dialogue. They couldn't remember any of the plot. But you know what they remembered? All the scenes in the movie where somebody was eating. Because they were just so focused on food. Obviously, right? So that's a picture of what it means. Blessed are those who hunger for righteousness, right relationship with God. Do you hunger for righteousness? Do you hunger and thirst for that right relationship with God? And I think this is one of the things that we take so much for granted, that we say, the fact that you and I could even have a relationship with God is the most amazing thing. Like, why would God want anything to do with me? Like, what do I possibly offer to God? What advantage does God have in relating to me? Like nothing. And yet God wants to have a relationship with me and with you. God sent his son, Jesus, to even pay the price so that you and I could have a relationship with him. And I think it's so sad and so tragic that we are so cavalier about that. And we take it, we think like, oh yeah, of course God would want to relate with me. Really, why? And that we don't hunger and thirst to relate to him and to be amazed that the holy God would even want to have a relationship with me. And so that is what Jesus is talking about here. And so jumping ahead to the next beatitude, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. So again, there's a progression of the beatitudes. So the person who has been forgiven of their sins because they recognize that I'm poor and I need Jesus. And so they now submit to God. They make themselves meek before God. And then they have this hungering for a right relationship with God. Such a person, it only makes sense. It will change the way that they relate to other people, right? A person who has received mercy from God because of what Jesus has done, I didn't deserve it. Why would a God even want to relate to me, let alone send his son Jesus to die for me? And then for that same person to not be merciful to fellow human beings or even want to be merciful to fellow human beings just doesn't make sense. When we are meek before a God who has been described as God of mercy, God who shows mercy, God who shows mercy to you. And for us to receive all of that mercy and say, I don't want to be merciful to that guy, I don't want to be merciful to her, just doesn't make sense. And so we need to, then it begins to change the way that we relate to our fellow people as we progress in this Beatitudes. The next one, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, the word pure or purity, the way that it's used in the Bible, is kind of different than maybe how you and I may think of the word pure. In the Old Testament, the closest concept would be holiness, where God says, I am holy, holy, holy. And God always tells his people, the Israelites, to be holy, to be set apart, right? So he says, don't act like the Egyptians when they were living in Egypt. And then when they came to the promised land, to the Canaanites, he says, don't learn from the Canaanites. Instead, you are to be separate in how you act. And I think that's very relevant to us because so many times we want to be just like everybody else. We want to blend in, we want to fit in, and that is so important to us. And God says, no, no, no. You be separate from them. You be set apart. That's what it means to be pure. Now, for us, though, it's very challenging because, truth be told, we're not pure in our hearts. Yes, there are parts of us that longs for God to have that righteousness, right relationship with God, but there's parts of our hearts that want so many other things. Oh man, if I could have that relationship with him, or if I could have that relationship with her and marry her one day, oh, that would be happiness for me. Oh, if I could get that career and I could succeed and make a lot of money, oh, that would mean happiness for me. There's so many things that split up our hearts, that causes our hearts to be divided, that we have a hard time with. Blessed are the pure in heart. Now here I want to give you a little bit of a very practical application, because people will approach a verse like this, and a Christian will say, you know what? It says, blessed are the pure in heart. God wants me to have a pure heart, but I don't have it. So because I don't have it, I can't apply this verse. And so I'm going to wait here and pray or read the Bible until I have a pure heart. I have a pure heart. Now I will go and be merciful to others. And now I will go and love others. It doesn't work like that. And so it's a loop where we feel like our heart's not in the right place, but I'm going to act as if my heart was in the right place towards my friend. So I'm going to pray for my friend, even though my heart doesn't have a lot of overflowing love. But as I do that, my heart gets changed. So I come back, and then I have more feelings for my friend now, more genuine love for him. And so then that motivates me to pray even more those kind of prayers. And it's kind of a loop. And I think that's often how we experience these kinds of verses. So I don't want to recommend to you to just wait until you have 100% purity of heart before you do anything as a Christian. You'll never do anything as a Christian then. Just go with even what little there is and start acting on it, and God will give you that heart. Okay, all right, so I gotta move quickly. The next one, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And so here, there's a difference between peacemakers and peace lovers. I think peace lovers are those people who just hate tension, hate awkwardness, and so they'll put up with all kinds of things that should be talked about in order to retain some kind of false peace. That's not what they're talking about here. Blessed are the peacemakers, are people who get in there where there's two people who are in opposition. And I'm going to do the work of trying to reconcile them. I'm going to try to repair this relationship. That is a peacemaker. And for those of us who are Christians, this is God's number one mission to all of us. As it says, sorry, okay, I gotta get to, okay. As it says in 2 Corinthians 5:18 and 20, all this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, as ambassadors of Christ, God is making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. And so this is an expression of what it means to be peacemakers, to go out there and share the gospel with people who are far from God. Now, as soon as I say that, I know that there's some pushback from some people saying, well, I really don't like sharing the gospel, even though I'm a Christian, even though the gospel has saved me, because I feel like when I go out there that I'm coming across as arrogant. Like, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm superior, you're inferior, and therefore, because I'm a Christian, you should be a Christian. That couldn't be further from the truth. When we go out there and act as Christ's ambassadors, one person has described it as, it's one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. We're not saying, look at me, I'm a Christian because I'm such an awesome person. No, we're saying, I'm poor in spirit. I was spiritually bankrupt. I was a messed up person. That's why I turned to Christ. I'm a beggar who needed bread desperately. I found bread. Now, the best wish for you is that you find bread too. So it's that kind of mentality. It's not us saying arrogant and saying we're better than them. And then finally, Jesus says, this is the last beatitude. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecute the prophets who were before you. And so no one can accuse Jesus of being a bait and switch tactic, right? Jesus says from the get-go, when you do this, when you go out there and make yourself a peacemaker, you're going to be persecuted. You're going to be persecuted big time, just like the prophets of long ago. And Jesus warns us. But Jesus says, rejoice and be glad when they do that, when you receive that, because that's an honor that you get to be persecuted in the same way as these heroes of the faith. And rejoice and be glad because great is your reward in heaven. And Jesus was never embarrassed about saying that for us to be motivated by our rewards in heaven. Now, I know I went really quickly through all 8 Beatitudes. We could probably spend a message on each of them. But I want to kind of wrap things up by going back to the first Beatitude. Remember, this was the very beginning of that progression. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So notice that it does not begin with virtue. It does not begin with somebody being a good, cleaned up person. It does not begin with somebody saying, look at me, I'm an awesome Christian. And so if you study the Beatitudes, and if your attitude is, I got this, watch me, I'm going to be the most awesome person who carries out these Beatitudes, then something got lost there. It doesn't work that way. It begins with, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And you know, I've been a Christian now for 30 years, and I never have stopped going back to the first beatitude. Every day I experience how poor I am in spirit. And that gives me an opportunity then to go to the next one, to mourn and grieve over who I am. And then to go to God and say, God, I blew it again. I want to submit to you, to be meek before you. And then I do this every day, every week of my life. And we never outgrow this. And so the Beatitudes that Jesus has given us here is not just something that we apply once in our life and we're done. But as Christians, we do this over and over again until one day we get to heaven. And then we can be free of sin and we can receive that heavenly reward that Jesus talked about in the last beatitude. And so I just want to conclude by saying to you, to really make this Beatitudes your daily posture before God. To start with the first one, to recognize, God, I am poor in spirit. And to just allow the Beatitudes to guide you as you pray before God and as you submit yourself before God. Okay, so let me go ahead and give you just a couple of prompts for you to think about. And I would like for you to just jot down your response in your notes or to pray over these things. But just think about these 8 Beatitudes. How would your life change if you could live according to these Beatitudes? And what would your life look like if you could live according to these Beatitudes? And then which one is the most challenging for you? So why don't you go ahead and just think about these things and pray about this on your own. And then I'm going to have the praise band come up and lead us in our closing song.